Let me tell you about an employee who learned that lesson the hard way. For an entire year, she carried a project that nobody else wanted. She stepped into gaps whenever they appeared, solved problems that weren't technically hers to solve, and consistently delivered measurable results. By every visible standard, she was doing exactly what ambitious employees are told to do. Then came performance review season. On the morning of her evaluation, she walked into her manager's office expecting a conversation about her work. What she didn't realize was that the most important part of that conversation had already happened. A completed evaluation form was sitting on the manager's desk before the meeting even began. For the next 40 minutes, her manager talked about communication style, collaboration, and areas where she could continue to grow. The discussion sounded professional, constructive even. When it ended, she received a rating of meets expectations. 3 months later, she was laid off. The review wasn't where the decision was made. It was where the decision was explained. Before this video is over, you'll understand exactly what happened in that room, who really influences performance ratings inside most organizations, and what you can do differently if you want the system to produce a different outcome in your favor. If this kind of analysis helps you understand what's actually happening inside companies, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. We don't talk about motivation here. We talk about strategy, incentives, and the hidden mechanics that shape careers. And understanding those mechanics can change the way you navigate your professional life. What performance reviews are really documenting. Once a year, millions of employees participate in a ritual that is presented as an objective assessment of their performance. They prepare carefully. They gather accomplishments, collect metrics, and build a case for why their work mattered. They walk into the meeting believing the conversation will be about what they achieved over the previous 12 months. Then something strange happens. The feedback often feels disconnected from the work itself. It's vague when it should be specific. It focuses on personality traits when it should focus on outcomes. Sometimes it emphasizes minor issues while barely acknowledging major contributions. And more often than most people realize, it aligns perfectly with decisions that appear to have been made long before the meeting ever took place. That isn't necessarily incompetence, and it usually isn't an accident. In many organizations, performance reviews serve purposes that have very little to do with development. Officially, they're about feedback. In practice, they're often used to support three categories of decisions: compensation, promotion opportunities, and workforce management. That last category matters more than most employees realize. When a company wants to justify a future employment decision, it needs documentation. It needs a record. It needs evidence showing that concerns existed before any action was taken. Performance reviews frequently become part of that record. Not because they're designed to measure your contribution with complete objectivity, but because they're useful tools for protecting the organization. That's why a performance review can sometimes tell two very different stories while using almost identical language. A rating of meets expectations might genuinely mean you're performing well and sitting in a stable position. It can also mean that someone has already begun building a case for limiting your advancement, reducing your compensation growth, or eventually eliminating your role. The document often looks the same in both situations. The tone sounds the same. The wording sounds professional, balanced, and constructive. From the employee's perspective, that's what makes it difficult to interpret. Most people assume they're receiving information about their future. In reality, they may be receiving an explanation for decisions that have already been made. And if you don't understand that distinction, you can spend years analyzing the wrong signals. You might leave the meeting believing the review was the beginning of a conversation about your future. Meanwhile, inside the organization, it may have been the final step in a process that started months earlier. Understanding that possibility doesn't mean becoming cynical. It means learning to see the system as it actually operates. Because the sooner you understand what performance reviews are truly documenting, the sooner you'll stop treating them as a simple report card and start recognizing them for what they often are: a reflection of organizational priorities, business realities, and decisions that extend far beyond your individual performance. One of the biggest misconceptions employees have about performance reviews is believing that their manager independently decides their rating. In some companies, that's true. In many others, it isn't. Long before your review reaches your calendar, a different conversation has already taken place behind closed doors. Managers gather with other managers. Department leaders compare employees across teams. Rankings are debated, adjusted, defended, and sometimes negotiated. This process is commonly called calibration. The official purpose is consistency. Organizations want to ensure that managers apply standards similarly across departments. But once human judgment enters the equation, something else enters with it: politics. Because during calibration meetings, your work is rarely evaluated directly. Your work is represented. And those are not the same thing. The people participating in these discussions often don't know your projects in detail. They haven't attended your meetings. They haven't watched you solve problems. They haven't seen the obstacles you've overcome. Instead, they're hearing a summary, a compressed version of your entire year delivered in a few minutes by your manager. Think about what that means. Can your contributions be explained clearly to someone who has never worked with you? Can the value you created be understood by people outside your function? Can your manager translate months of effort into a compelling argument under pressure? Because that's often what determines how you're perceived, not the full reality of your work, the story that survives the room. And once you understand that, another uncomfortable reality becomes impossible to ignore. The employee who creates the most value is not always the employee who receives the highest rating. Sometimes it's the employee whose value is easiest to explain. Sometimes it's the employee whose accomplishments fit neatly into metrics. Sometimes it's the employee whose manager has more credibility, influence, or political capital than everyone else at the table. In theory, organizations reward performance. In practice, performance still has to compete for attention. Imagine two employees. The first quietly prevents major problems from happening. She keeps critical processes running, resolves issues before they become visible, and protects the organization from risks nobody else notices. The second leads a highly visible initiative that attracts executive attention. Both contribute. Both create value. But when calibration discussions begin, one story is easier to tell than the other. One employee has visible wins. The other has invisible prevention. And invisible work is notoriously difficult to defend. The irony is that organizations often depend heavily on people doing invisible work. Yet the systems used to evaluate employees frequently favor what can be seen, measured, and easily communicated. As a result, many employees spend years believing that effort automatically creates recognition. It doesn't. Effort creates potential value. Recognition requires visibility. And visibility operates according to entirely different rules. That's why some people leave review cycles confused. They're looking at the amount of work they performed and comparing it to the outcome they received. What they don't see is that another competition was taking place simultaneously. A competition for attention. A competition for narrative control. A competition for scarce opportunities. And those competitions are often happening in rooms they never enter. What's especially painful is what happens afterward. Many employees assume the outcome reveals a personal deficiency. They convince themselves they need to work harder, volunteer for more projects, stay later, answer more emails, or push themselves even further. Sometimes they spend years trying to fix a problem that never actually existed. Because the issue wasn't necessarily their performance. The issue was how their performance was perceived, communicated, and positioned inside the organization. Meanwhile, the person who received the stronger rating may not have worked longer hours. They may not have solved more difficult problems. They may not even have delivered better results. But when the right people were paying attention, their contributions were easier to see. That's a difficult truth to accept because it challenges one of the most comforting assumptions people carry throughout their careers: that great work naturally speaks for itself. Most of the time it doesn't. Work doesn't speak. People speak. Managers speak. Executives speak. Narratives speak. And once those narratives begin circulating, they often become more influential than the underlying facts. The feedback you eventually receive in your formal review is frequently shaped by those conversations. That's why the explanation you hear during your evaluation isn't always the cause of your rating. Quite often, it's the justification that emerged after the rating had already been decided. The review meeting feels like the main event, because it's the only part you get to see. But the most important discussion may have happened weeks earlier. In a conference room, on a video call, or inside a calibration meeting where your future was being discussed by people who knew your name far better than they knew your work. And understanding that reality changes the way you should approach the entire process. Because once you recognize that performance alone isn't enough, you stop focusing exclusively on doing great work. You start paying attention to whether great work is actually being seen, understood, and remembered by the people who ultimately influence your career.